Buenas tardes, les damos la bienvenida a este taller de trabajo llamado Periodismo y Acceso a la Información Pública. Quiero hacer una breve introducción. La verdad que el desafío del periodismo en este tiempo ha generado bastante discusión. La profesión, la labor de que realizamos los periodistas se ve a veces en entredicho en este advenimiento de Internet, las redes sociales, la gran cantidad de información que hoy día fluye y que es posible de capturar a través de los más diversos soportes. El mismo caso el año pasado, ¿no es cierto?, de Wikileaks, en que generó un debate interesante con esa gran cantidad de información que recibieron las personas. Hoy día el público exige información. Es difícil pensar en documentos secretos, en documentos privados o reservados. ¿Y cuál es la labor del periodismo en ese mar de documentos? También es una pregunta válida. ¿Cómo manejamos, cómo filtramos, cómo podemos de alguna manera clasificar y hacer más digerible esa cantidad de información que le está llegando a las personas? ¿Dónde está el valor agregado entonces? Y dónde podemos hacer una diferencia en ayudar realmente y en que la información que llega a las personas sea útil para ellos. El año pasado hicimos este panel y estábamos recién partiendo con la ley en Chile. Recibimos algunas experiencias internacionales al respecto. Y se hablaba mucho de cómo en estos ritmos de absoluta inmediatez del periodismo, con las redes sociales como Twitter, en que incluso es posible enterarse a través de Twitter antes que de un medio de comunicación de algún hecho, cómo en esa realidad podía funcionar el periodismo de investigación, que necesita otros tiempos. El editor jefe del área legal del New York Times, el Boston Globe, el año pasado, David McGraw, nos decía que el New York Times y que los principales diarios de Estados Unidos habían hecho un compromiso con el periodismo de investigación, que sentían que era su deber mantener esa área, que sabían que era cara, que sabían que requería de un tipo de trabajo distinto, pero que era necesario y que por lo mismo ellos incluso estaban llegando a las cortes, en el caso de Estados Unidos, y defendiendo la ley de acceso a la información en ese país. En Chile estamos partiendo en este trabajo del uso del acceso a la información pública. Los tiempos son difíciles. Hacer una solicitud y esperar 20 días para la respuesta de la autoridad parece impensable justamente en este tiempo de inmediatez. Pero, por lo menos lo que nosotros, algunos aquí que queremos fomentar el uso de la ley, creemos es que hay distintos tiempos según los distintos tipos de pauta que uno haga. Que está lo inmediato, lo del minuto, lo del día a día, pero que también hay otros temas que son de más largo aliento. Y eso es lo que yo quiero invitarlos a conocer de la mesa que tengo aquí presente. Vamos a compartir con el señor Anthony Fargo, profesor de la Universidad de Indiana de Estados Unidos, periodista, y que lleva bastante tiempo enseñando en Estados Unidos justamente el valor de FOIA, de la Ley Federal de Acceso a la Información de ese país, y también del valor de la libertad de expresión. Y después vamos a compartir con periodistas chilenos que están usando la ley, que la han usado y que tienen sus experiencias de dulce y de gras. Nos van a decir lo bueno y nos van a decir lo malo, pero esperamos aprender de ellos. Pedro Ramírez, de CIPER Chile, Carola Fuentes, de CNN, y con una larga data de investigación antes en Canal 13, y Andrés Sherman, profesor hoy de la Universidad Diego Portales y que también le ha tocado trabajar con medios en regiones. Voy a dejar de inmediato con el señor Anthony Fargo para que comience su presentación. Gracias.
I want to thank the council for having me here, and also thank all of you for showing up tonight. This is a wonderful turnout. At academic conferences in the United States, the conferences after about 5 o'clock tend to have 5 or 6 people in them, so this was very heartening to see. I'm going to try to summarize 220 years of First Amendment law and 45 years of experience with the Freedom of Information Act in about 15 minutes. My guess is I'm going to leave some things out, but I hope that nothing important will get lost in the translation. And one of the things I would like to do while I'm talking is share with you some famous quotes from various people who have spoken about the importance of freedom of the press and freedom of information. 40 years ago, the United States Supreme Court went into an extraordinary session during what was normally its summer recess to solve a constitutional crisis. The government had sought injunctions to stop two of the nation's leading newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post, from publishing any further excerpts from a report that came to be known as the Pentagon Papers. A worker at the Pentagon, the headquarters for the United States military, had stumbled upon this secret report, which detailed how the United States had become involved in the Vietnam War. He copied the report and gave copies to the newspapers, which published excerpts over several days. The government argued that release of the report would harm national security. Judges in New York and Washington disagreed over whether the government had the power to censor the press, and the Supreme Court thus had to meet to resolve this constitutional issue. Because of the haste with which they met, the court's 9 members could not agree on a single majority opinion. So the court voted 6-3 to bar the government from preventing the newspapers from publishing, agreeing with one of the judges who first heard the case that the government had not shown a clear danger existed to the nation's security. Each justice wrote a separate opinion, and perhaps the most powerful was Justice Hugo Black's. In it, Justice Black wrote, "The government's power to censor the press was abolished so that the press would remain forever free to censure the government. The press was protected so that it could bear the secrets of government and inform the people. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government." Secrets are anathema to democracy. Governments must, of course, keep certain secrets to protect citizens from various serious threats, but the fear of what may grow in the dark if darkness is the norm instead of the exception leads both the press and the public to expect access to as much information as possible about what federal, state, and local governments are doing. I was pleased this morning to hear President Piñera quote Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who said in 1913, "Sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants, electric light the most efficient policeman." The history of the United States provides numerous examples of leading figures, including presidents, Supreme Court justices, members of Congress, and others extolling the virtues of informed citizenry and a broad right to freedom of speech and freedom of the press. The rhetoric about press freedom and the people's right to information about its government is based on the nature of American government and the experiment that Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and other early post-independence leaders designed when they crafted the Constitution. Alexander Meiklejohn, a leading American scholar, probably best summed up the spirit behind the United States structure shortly after World War II. Meiklejohn wrote that American citizens were both the rulers and the ruled. They consented by being U.S. citizens to abide by the laws and regulations that their representatives created because they elected those representatives. The representatives were the servants of the citizens who elected them, but also the ones empowered to make laws that those citizens would then obey. Huguette Labelle this morning made a similar point in the first panel with regard to transparency when she noted that agencies are custodians of records, but we are the owners of those records. Because of the responsibility that citizens have to elect representatives who will look after their best interests, Meiklejohn wrote that voters needed to be made as wise as possible. Tying freedom of speech to the concept of self-government, Meiklejohn said that in order to ensure that voters had all the information they needed, no idea should be considered out of bounds, no matter how unpopular it might be at the moment. As he put it, to be afraid of ideas, any idea, is to be unfit for self-government. Any such suppression of ideas about the common good, the First Amendment condemns with its absolute disapproval. The freedom of ideas shall not be abridged. Some years later, the Supreme Court echoed Michael John and in fact quoted him in what was arguably its most important First Amendment case of the 20th century, New York Times versus Sullivan, in which it made it much more difficult for public officials to win libel suits against the press or against members of the public. In stating its reasoning behind this decision, the court said, "We consider this case against the background of a profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open, and that it may well include vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp attacks on government and public officials." Those are powerful words, and anyone who has watched coverage of our election campaigns since 1964 knows that the public and the press have taken those words to heart, for better or for worse. But there have always been a couple of inconsistencies in the American embrace of wide open debate and the great respect shown to freedom of the press. Sometimes people forget that there was no specific guarantee of a free press in the original Constitution. It was added later at the insistence of several states that ratified the Constitution with deep reservations because it contained no provisions for the protections of individual rights. In fact, Alexander Hamilton, one of the three defenders of the Constitution, who wrote a series of newspaper essays later known as the Federalist Papers in 1787 and 1788, argued that no guarantee of a free press was needed, and even if one was written, it would be impractical. "What is the liberty of the press?" he asked. "Who can give it any definition which would not leave the utmost latitude for evasion? Its security, whatever fine declarations may be inserted in any constitution respecting it, must altogether depend on public opinion and on the general spirit of the people and of the government." Hamilton and his co-writers, including James Madison, were overruled, and Madison came to be the chief architect of what would become the Bill of Rights, approved by the first Congress and ratified by the states in 1791. But the wording of the First Amendment, which states in part that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, has led to some confusion over the years. Did those four words, "or of the press," refer to the institutional media, such as newspapers, or to a right shared by all persons? And what was necessary to avoid an abridgment or limitation on the freedom of the press? The Supreme Court, which in the United States has the ultimate responsibility when it comes to interpreting the Constitution, has determined, based on its understanding of the condition of the press when the First Amendment was written, that the press clause was meant to protect a right of all individuals, not just newspapers or other media. As the court put it in Brandsburg versus Hayes in 1972, liberty of the press is the right of the lonely pamphleteer who uses carbon paper or a mimeograph just as much as of the large metropolitan publisher who utilizes the latest photocomposition methods. This is not to say that everyone agrees. In that same Supreme Court decision, Justice William O. Douglas wrote a very stirring dissenting opinion that argued for a much different view of the press and its rights. The press, he wrote, had a preferred position in our constitutional scheme, not to enable it to make money, not to set newsmen apart as a favorite class, but to bring fulfillment to the public's right to know. Justice Potter Stewart, in a law school speech in 1974, argued that it would be a constitutional redundancy to equate the speech rights of all citizens with the press rights protected in the First Amendment. But in trying to reconcile his personal view with the majority view of the court, Justice Stewart captured well the conflict between the aspirations of the press and the constitutional reality. He told the law students at the University of California, "The press is free to do battle against secrecy and deception in government, but the press cannot expect from the Constitution any guarantee that it will succeed. There is no constitutional